The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the sterile detention facility as Sarah Martinez stood with her hands cuffed behind her back, trying to maintain whatever dignity she had left. The concrete walls seemed to close in around her as three guards in tactical gear flanked her on either side. She had been in worse situations before, much worse, but something about this particular moment felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made her skin crawl despite her years of training to remain calm under pressure. "Strip search," barked the commanding officer, a stocky man with graying temples and cold, calculating eyes. His badge read Commander Walsh, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen it all and was impressed by nothing. "Protocol for all high-risk detainees. You know the drill. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Sarah's jaw tightened as she processed the command. High risk. Detainee. If only they knew just how high risk she truly was. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a decorated CIA operative with 15 years of service to her country, being treated like a common criminal in what appeared to be a military detention facility somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The black hood they had placed over her head during transport had been removed only minutes ago, and she was still trying to piece together exactly where she had been brought. The events leading to this moment played back in her mind like a broken record. It had started as a routine extraction mission in Eastern Europe, or at least what her handlers had told her was routine. Intelligence suggested that a high-value asset needed to be pulled from a compromised safe house in Prague. Sarah had done dozens of these operations before. She could navigate the narrow cobblestone streets of the old city blindfolded, speak fluent Czech with a convincing accent, and blend into any crowd with the practiced ease of a professional chameleon. But something had gone wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. The safe house had been empty when she arrived, except for signs of a violent struggle. Overturned furniture, bullet holes in the walls, and most disturbing of all, fresh blood splattered across the hardwood floor. Her contact, a man known only as Victor, was nowhere to be found. The extraction point had been compromised. Her backup team wasn't responding to radio calls, and within hours, she found herself surrounded by what appeared to be local law enforcement, though their equipment and tactics suggested they were anything but local police. Now, standing in this detention facility with its unmarked walls and personnel who refused to identify themselves, Sarah was beginning to understand that she hadn't just walked into a trap. She had walked into something much more complex, something that had the fingerprints of multiple intelligence agencies all over it. The question was, which side were these people on, and more importantly, did they know who she really was? Commander Walsh stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold air of the facility. "I said strip search. That means everything comes off. Now." The female guard to Sarah's left, a tall, athletic woman with short-cropped blonde hair and the kind of posture that screamed military training, stepped forward with a pair of latex gloves already on her hands. Her NAMA tag was conspicuously absent, just like everyone else in this place. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," she said, in a voice that suggested she had no preference either way. Sarah had endured interrogations before. She had been captured, tortured, and escaped from situations that would have broken most people. But there was something uniquely humiliating about being forced to undress in front of strangers, about having your personal autonomy stripped away, along with your clothing. It was a psychological tactic as old as warfare itself. Break down the subject's sense of self, make them vulnerable, make them compliant. But Sarah Martinez was not most people. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I have rights under the Geneva Convention, and I demand to know what charges I'm being held under." Commander Walsh let out a short, humorless laugh. "Rights? Lady, you lost your rights the moment you were found at the scene of an international incident with enough classified material on you to start World War III. Now, for the last time strip, the classified material. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to remember exactly what had been in the bag she was carrying when they took her. Standard operational equipment, encrypted communication devices, emergency currency, false identification documents. Nothing that should have raised red flags to this level, unless someone had planted something else in that bag. Something that would make her look like a rogue agent, or worse, a double agent working for a foreign power. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone had set her up, and they had done it with surgical precision. The female guard was losing patience. Last chance to cooperate voluntarily. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, running through her options. She could resist, but that would only make things worse and potentially violent. She could continue to demand her rights, but clearly, these people weren't operating under normal legal constraints. Or she could comply, hope that her training and experience would see her through whatever came next, and look for an opportunity to turn the tables. She opened her eyes and met Commander Walsh's gaze directly. "Fine," she said. "But this is a mistake. You're going to regret." The process of undressing under the watchful eyes of armed guards was designed to be dehumanizing, and it was working exactly as intended. Sarah methodically removed her jacket, her boots, her tactical pants, each item being immediately seized and examined by the guards as if they expected to find hidden weapons or communications devices sewn into the fabric. The cold air of the detention facility raised goosebumps along her arms, but she refused to shiver, refused to show any sign of weakness that could be exploited. Commander Walsh watched with the detached interest of someone conducting a routine inspection. But Sarah caught the subtle tells that indicated he was more invested in this than he was letting on. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes kept flicking to something behind her, the barely perceptible nod he gave to someone she couldn't see. This wasn't just a strip search, this was a performance, and she was the unwilling star. "The shirt," the female guard said, snapping her fingers impatiently. Her accent was American, but there was something else underneath it, something that suggested she had spent significant time abroad. Sarah had developed an ear for these things over the years, and this woman's speech pattern suggested extensive training in linguistics and accent modification. In other words, she was likely intelligence services as well, though which agency remained unclear. Sarah pulled her shirt over her head, revealing a standard-issue sports bra and a torso marked with the kinds of scars that told stories. A knife wound from an operation in Syria, bullet graze from Afghanistan, the thin white line across her ribs from an encounter with Russian agents in Berlin. Each mark was a reminder of her service, of the prices she had paid in blood and pain for her country. But it was what the guards couldn't see yet that would change everything. "Bra and underwear," Commander Walsh said, his voice carrying a note of impatience that suggested they were running on some kind of timeline. All of it. As Sarah reached behind her back to unclasp her bra, her mind was working furiously to piece together the puzzle of her situation. The facility was clearly purpose-built for detention and interrogation, too sophisticated for local law enforcement, too well-equipped for a standard military base. The guards carried themselves with the confidence of elite operators. Their equipment was top-tier, and their protocols were clearly well-rehearsed. This was a black site, the kind of place that officially didn't exist, and where inconvenient people could disappear without a trace. The question that kept nagging at her was simple. If they thought she was a foreign agent or a traitor, why not just execute her? Why go through this elaborate process of detention and humiliation? Unless they needed something from her information, confirmation of something they suspected, or perhaps they were trying to break her psychologically before moving to the next phase of whatever plan they had in motion. She let the bra fall to the floor and immediately moved to remove her underwear, wanting to get this ordeal over with as quickly as possible. The sooner she was through this degrading process, the sooner she could start working on finding a way out of here. Sarah had escaped from worse situations, though admittedly, she usually had backup equipment and at least some idea of where. She was being held. "Turn around," the female guard commanded. Slowly. This was it. Sarah took a deep breath and began to turn, knowing that in a few seconds, everything would change. The tattoo on her back wasn't something she advertised, in fact. Very few people in the world even knew it existed. It had been done years ago, during her early days with the agency, back when she was young and perhaps a bit too idealistic about what it meant to serve in the shadows. The design was deceptively simple, a small eagle perched atop a shield, with the letters CIA incorporated into the design in a way that was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Most intelligence operatives would never dream of getting such a tattoo. It was a violation of every principle of operational security, a permanent mark that could identify you to enemies, compromise missions, and potentially get you killed. But Sarah had been different back then. She had wanted something to remind her of who she was and what she stood for, even when she was pretending to be someone else in some godforsaken corner of the world. Over the years, she had come to regret that youthful decision more times than she could count. The tattoo had forced her to be more careful about certain types of operations, had limited her effectiveness in some scenarios, and had required creative costuming solutions more often than she cared to admit. But she had never been able to bring herself to have it removed. It was part of her identity, part of her history, and despite the complications it caused, it served as a reminder of the oath she had taken and the principles she fought to uphold. As she completed her turn, Sarah heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her. She couldn't see Commander Walsh's face, but she could practically feel the change in the room's atmosphere. The casual professionalism of the guards shifted to something more alert, more focused. Whispered conversations began in the corners of the room, and she heard footsteps as someone moved quickly toward what she assumed was a communication device. Well, Commander Walsh said, his voice now carrying a very different tone than it had moments before. That changes things considerably. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah could feel every eye in the facility focused on the small tattoo between her shoulder blades, could practically hear the gears turning in Commander Walsh's head as he processed this new information. She had seen this reaction before, though. Never quite in these circumstances. The tattoo was like a key that unlocked doors, sometimes the right doors, sometimes very much the wrong ones. "Nobody move," Walsh commanded, his voice sharp with authority. The casual demeanor he had maintained throughout the strip search had evaporated completely, replaced by the focused intensity of someone who had just realized they were dealing with a situation far more complex than they had anticipated. "Johnson, get Director Morrison on the line immediately. Priority Alpha." Sarah heard rapid footsteps as one of the guards rushed to comply with the order. Priority Alpha, that was. Military speak for the highest level of urgency, reserved for situations that could have national security implications. The fact that they were treating her tattoo as Priority Alpha intelligence meant that either they knew exactly who she was and what she represented, or they suspected something that scared them enough to wake up whoever Director Morrison was. Regardless of the hour. "Agent Martinez," Walsh said, using her real name for the first time since her capture. The shift was jarring. One moment she was being treated like an anonymous terrorist. The next she was being addressed by her actual identity and rank. "I think we need to have a very different conversation than the one I was planning to have." Sarah remained silent, standing naked in the middle of the room while her mind raced through the implications of this development. They knew who she was, had probably known from the beginning, which meant this entire charade, the detention, the strip search, the psychological intimidation, had all been theater designed to accomplish something specific. But what? The female guard who had been conducting the search stepped back, her latex gloves still on, but her posture entirely changed. Where before she had been methodical and impersonal, now she seemed almost deferential. "Commander," she said in a low voice, "should I?" "Give her something to wear," Walsh interrupted. "A jumpsuit, blanket, anything. And clear the room, except for essential personnel." As a standard orange jumpsuit was thrust into her hands, Sarah began to piece together what was happening. The CIA tattoo had served as authentication proof that she was exactly who she claimed to be. But authentication for what purpose? If this was a legitimate U.S. government facility, why had they been treating her like an enemy combatant? If it wasn't legitimate, why would her CIA affiliation matter to them? She pulled on the jumpsuit, grateful for the warmth and coverage, but still wary of the sudden change in treatment. In her experience, when captors suddenly became more respectful, it usually meant they wanted something: information, cooperation, or compliance with some larger agenda that required her willing participation rather than her forced submission. The room cleared quickly, leaving only Sarah, Commander Walsh, and the female guard whose name she still didn't know. Walsh was pacing now, occasionally glancing at her tattoo, even though it was covered by the jumpsuit, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had seen. 15 years, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. 15 years with the agency, multiple commendations, operations on every continent except Antarctica. 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, and a Distinguished Service Cross that officially doesn't exist because the mission it was awarded for never happened. Sarah kept her expression neutral, but internally she was stunned. That level of detail about her service record wasn't available to just anyone. Whoever these people were, they had access to classified information at the highest levels of government. The kind of access that required authorization from the Director of Central Intelligence himself. "You know what's interesting, Agent Martinez?" Walsh continued, still pacing. "According to our records, you died 3 days ago in Prague. Car accident. They said, very tragic. Your body was supposedly cremated and your ashes returned to your family in New Mexico." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. They had faked her death. Someone in the agency, someone with significant authority and resources, had officially killed off Sarah Martinez while she was still very much alive. Which meant that as far as the world was concerned, she was a ghost, a non-person with no legal rights, no official existence, and no one looking for her. "So you can understand our confusion," Walsh said, stopping his pacing to look directly at her. "When a dead CIA operative shows up at the scene of an international incident carrying enough classified material to compromise ongoing operations in half a dozen countries." Sarah found her voice. "What classified material?" "I was carrying standard operational equipment for an extraction mission. Nothing more. Standard operational equipment doesn't include detailed schematics of Russian military installations, Agent Martinez. It doesn't include the real names and addresses of deep cover assets in China. And it certainly doesn't include financial records showing payments from foreign intelligence services." The setup was even more elaborate than she had imagined. Someone hadn't just planted evidence on her. They had created an entire false narrative, designed to paint her as a traitor of the highest order. But who had the resources and access to pull off something this sophisticated? And more importantly, why had they chosen her as their patsy? "I've never seen any of that material in my life," she said firmly. "Someone is playing a very dangerous game here, and you're letting them use you as pawns." Walsh smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's exactly what we're going to find out, Agent Martinez. Because dead or alive, you're going to help us get to the bottom of this." The interrogation room they moved Sarah to was a stark contrast to the detention area where she had been stripped and searched. This room had the appearance of a professional government facility: clean white walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs on opposite sides, and a large mirror that was obviously one-way glass. The lighting was bright but not harsh, designed to keep subjects alert without causing physical discomfort. Sarah had been in rooms like this before, but usually on the other side of the table. Commander Walsh sat across from her, a thick manila folder spread open between them. The female guard, who had finally identified herself as Agent Reynolds, stood near the door with her arms crossed, maintaining the kind of watchful stance that suggested she was ready for trouble but not expecting it. The dynamic had shifted completely since the discovery of Sarah's tattoo, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that she was being carefully managed, guided towards some predetermined outcome. "Let's start with Prague," Walsh said, pulling out a series of photographs from the folder. "This is the safe house where you were supposed to meet your contact, Viktor Petrov. As you can see, it's been thoroughly searched, and we found evidence of significant violence." Sarah studied the photographs carefully. The images showed the same scene she had discovered upon her arrival: overturned furniture, bullet holes, blood spatter, but from angles she hadn't seen during her brief time in the compromised location. More troubling was the fact that these photos appeared to have been taken before her arrival, suggesting that whoever was behind this operation had been monitoring the situation in real time. "These photos were taken 3 hours before I ever set foot in that building," she observed, looking up at Walsh. "Which means you knew the safe house was compromised before you sent me there. The question is whether you're part of whatever happened to Viktor, or if someone is manipulating both of us." Walsh's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated her observation had hit home. Viktor Petrov was found dead 2 days ago in a canal outside the city. 3 gunshot wounds to the chest, execution style. Very professional work. The news hit Sarah harder than she expected. She had worked with Viktor on and off for nearly a decade. He was a reliable asset, careful, methodical, and paranoid enough to have survived in the intelligence game far longer than most people in his position. If someone had managed to get close enough to execute him, it meant they had resources and planning capabilities that went well beyond ordinary criminal organizations. "Viktor was one of the most careful operatives I've ever worked with," Sarah said. "Whoever killed him knew his patterns, his safe houses, his communication methods. That kind of intelligence doesn't come from the street. No, it doesn't." Walsh pulled out another set of photographs, these showing Viktor's body as it had been found. Sarah forced herself to look, noting the precision of the wound placement and the lack of defensive injuries. "It comes from someone with access to classified agency files. Someone who knew Viktor's entire operational history and could predict his behavior under pressure." The implication hung in the air between them. A mole, someone inside the CIA, had been feeding information to hostile forces, and that someone had orchestrated both Viktor's death and Sarah's current predicament. But the question remained, who and why? "The classified material we found in your possession," Walsh continued, pulling out a series of documents that Sarah had never seen before in her life. "These include detailed intelligence assessments on Russian military capabilities, financial records showing payments from Chinese intelligence services, and most damning of all, a complete list of American assets operating in Eastern Europe." Sarah studied the documents, her mind racing as she tried to understand how they could possibly have ended up in her possession. The intelligence assessments were stamped with classification levels that were above her clearance. The financial records showed payments to an account she had never opened, and the asset list included the real names of people whose identities were supposed to be compartmentalized at the highest levels of the agency. "I've never seen any of these documents before," she said firmly. "And even if I had access to this information, why would I carry it around in a bag during an extraction operation? That's operational security 101. You never carry anything that could compromise other agents unless absolutely necessary. That's an excellent question. Agent Reynolds spoke for the first time since entering the room. Which brings us to the most interesting part of this whole situation. These documents weren't just found in your bag, Agent Martinez. They were found in a secret compartment that required specific knowledge to access. Knowledge that only you should have had. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The bag she had been carrying was standard issue, but it did contain a hidden compartment that she had modified years ago, according to her own specifications. The modification was something she had never reported to her handlers, never documented in any official capacity. It was her own private security measure, designed to carry emergency items that could save her life if everything else went wrong. That's impossible, she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she was beginning to understand the terrifying sophistication of the setup she was facing. No one else knew about that compartment. Exactly, Walsh said, leaning forward. Which means either you're lying to us about your involvement in whatever happened in Prague, or someone has been watching you very closely for a very long time. Someone who knows your methods, your equipment, your personal modifications to standard gear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The room fell silent as Sarah processed this information. The implications were staggering. If someone had been conducting surveillance on her detailed enough to know about unauthorized modifications to her equipment, they had been planning this operation for months, possibly years. The level of resources and access required for that kind of long-term surveillance suggested involvement from a major intelligence agency. But which one? And why target her specifically? There's something else, Walsh said, pulling out a final document from the folder. We've been monitoring communications intercepts for the past 72 hours, looking for any chatter related to the Prague incident. 3 hours ago, we intercepted a conversation between known Russian intelligence operatives discussing a successful recruitment operation. They mentioned an American agent by the code name Phoenix Rising. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Phoenix Rising had been her operational code name during her first assignment with the agency 15 years ago. It was a designation that appeared in exactly 3 classified documents, all of which were stored in the most secure archives at Langley. The only way foreign intelligence services could know that code name was if they had access to those archives, or if someone with that access was feeding them information. Someone inside the agency has been building a case against you for a very long time, Agent Martinez, Walsh continued. The question we need to answer is whether you're a victim of an elaborate frame job, or if you've been playing a much deeper game than anyone realized. Sarah stared at the document containing references to her old code name, her mind reeling from the implications. Phoenix Rising, she hadn't heard that designation in over a decade. It had been retired after her 3rd year with the agency, replaced with newer operational identities as her career progressed and her missions became more complex. The fact that foreign intelligence services were using it now suggested that someone had been building a comprehensive file on her operational history, going back to the very beginning of her career. I need to make a phone call, Sarah said, looking directly at Walsh. There are people at Langley who can verify my identity and confirm that I've been framed. My handler, Deputy Director Harrison, the Counterintelligence Division. We've already tried that, Agent Reynolds interrupted, moving away from her position by the door. According to official records, Agent Sarah Martinez died in Prague 3 days ago. When we attempted to contact Deputy Director Harrison about this situation, we were told that he's never heard of you. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Harrison had been her handler for 8 years, had personally overseen dozens of her operations, had recommended her for commendations and promotions. The idea that he would deny knowing her was inconceivable. unless he was part of whatever conspiracy had led to her current situation. That's impossible, Sarah said, but her voice lacked the conviction she had maintained throughout the interrogation. Tom Harrison recruited me personally. He's been my handler since you were transferred to the European Division in 2017, Walsh finished, consulting his notes. Yes, we have records of that assignment. What's interesting is that Deputy Director Harrison's personal files show no record of your recruitment, no documentation of your operational history under his supervision, and no memory of ever working with an agent named Sarah Martinez. Sarah felt the room beginning to spin as the full scope of what she was facing began to sink in. Someone hadn't just framed her for treason. They had systematically erased her from official records, eliminated her connections within the agency, and created a narrative in which she was either dead or had never existed in the first place. The level of coordination required for such an operation was staggering, suggesting involvement from the highest levels of the intelligence community. Memory modification, she whispered, more to herself than to her interrogators. They've used memory modification techniques on Harrison and possibly others. Walsh and Reynolds exchanged glances. Memory modification was one of the CIA's most closely guarded secrets, a program that officially didn't exist, but was whispered about in the darkest corners of the intelligence world. The technology had been developed during the Cold War as a way to protect sensitive information from enemy interrogation, but rumors suggested it had evolved into something far more sophisticated, tool for selectively editing the memories of intelligence personnel to maintain operational security or eliminate inconvenient witnesses. That's a very serious accusation, Agent Martinez, Walsh said carefully. Memory modification programs are highly classified, and knowledge of their existence is limited to a very small number of people within the government. I know because I've been through the process myself, Sarah replied, the memory suddenly coming back to her with startling clarity. 3 years ago, after the Belgrade operation, there were aspects of that mission that were deemed too sensitive for me to remember. I underwent voluntary memory modification to remove specific details while preserving my general operational knowledge. The Belgrade operation, Sarah's mind raced as she tried to piece together fragments of memories that felt incomplete, like a puzzle with missing pieces. She remembered being in Serbia, remembered a high-value target, remembered that something had gone catastrophically wrong. But the specifics were hazy, wrapped in a fog that she had always attributed to the stress and trauma of the mission. What if the Belgrade operation is connected to what's happening now? She asked, looking between Walsh and Reynolds. What if someone has been using memory modification to cover their tracks, and I stumbled onto something that threatened to expose them? Reynolds moved closer to the table, her expression more serious than it had been at any point during the interrogation. Tell us what you remember about Belgrade. Everything, no matter how fragmentary or unclear. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to push through the mental barriers that had been placed in her memory. The process was painful, like trying to remember a dream that was slipping away even as she grasped for it. But gradually, pieces began to emerge. There was a meeting, she said slowly. A clandestine meeting between American and Russian intelligence operatives. I was supposed to be conducting surveillance, but something went wrong. I saw faces, heard conversations that I wasn't supposed to witness. There was talk of a joint operation, something that would compromise both American and Russian assets for the greater good of some larger agenda. The fragments were coming faster now, memories surfacing like debris from a shipwreck. One of the Americans at that meeting, I recognized him. He was someone high up in the agency hierarchy, someone who shouldn't have been meeting with Russian operatives under any circumstances. When I tried to report what I had seen, I was told that the mission had been classified beyond my clearance level and that I needed to undergo memory modification for national security reasons. Walsh was taking notes rapidly, his earlier casual demeanor completely gone. Do you remember who the American was? Any identifying features, codey names, anything that could help us identify him? Sarah pressed her hands against her temples, fighting against the mental blocks that had been placed in her memory. The pain was excruciating, like trying to push through a wall of broken glass, but she could feel something important just beyond her reach. Harrison, she gasped suddenly, the name emerging from the fog of suppressed memories. It was Tom Harrison. My handler was at that meeting, shaking hands with Russian intelligence operatives and discussing operations that would get American agents killed. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. If Harrison had been working with foreign intelligence services for years, it explained how someone could have such detailed knowledge of Sarah's operational methods, her equipment modifications, her personal history. It also explained why he would deny knowing her when contacted about her current situation. She represented a threat to whatever conspiracy he was involved in. That's why they faked my death, Sarah continued, the pieces finally falling into place. They needed to eliminate me as a witness, but they also needed to make sure I couldn't surface later with evidence of what I had seen. By officially killing me off and framing me as a traitor, they neutralized the threat I represented while discrediting anything I might say in the future. The silence in the interrogation room stretched for what felt like hours as Walsh and Reynolds processed Sarah's revelation about Deputy Director Harrison. The implications were staggering. If a senior CIA official had been compromised and was working with foreign intelligence services, it would represent one of the most significant security breaches in the agency's history. But it would also explain the sophisticated nature of the operation that had led to Sarah's current predicament. We need to verify this information, Walsh said finally, closing the folder in front of him. If what you're saying is true, then we're dealing with a conspiracy that goes to the highest levels of the intelligence community. But we're also dealing with allegations that could destroy careers and compromise national security if they're false. Sarah leaned forward, her hands flat on the metal table. I understand the gravity of what I'm saying. But think about it logically. How else could someone have orchestrated something this complex? They knew my operational patterns, my equipment modifications, my personal history going back 15 years. They had access to classified documents above my clearance level. They could manipulate official records to fake my death, and they could use memory modification techniques on my handler. That level of access and authority doesn't exist outside the highest echelons of the agency. Agent Reynolds had been quiet throughout Sarah's revelation, but now she spoke up with a tone that suggested she was struggling with her own doubts about the situation. There's something else we haven't told you, Agent Martinez. This facility where you're being held, it's not an official government installation. The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. What do you mean, not official? It's a black site, but not one that appears in any government records, Reynolds continued. The funding comes from off-the-book sources. The personnel are all contractors with plausible deniability, and the operations conducted here are designed to never officially exist. In other words, if something were to happen to you here, there would be no record of you ever being held at this location. Sarah felt the walls of the room closing in around her as she realized the full extent of her vulnerability. She was being held at a location that didn't officially exist, by people who could deny any knowledge of her detention, in a situation where she had already been declared legally dead. If the conspiracy against her was as far-reaching as she suspected, she could disappear completely without anyone ever knowing what had happened to her. So whose black site is this? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. That's what we've been trying to figure out, Walsh replied. We were contracted to detain and interrogate a suspected foreign agent who had been compromised during an operation in Prague. We were told you were a rogue CIA operative who had been selling secrets to the Russians and Chinese. The evidence provided to us seemed overwhelming: classified documents in your possession, financial records showing payments from foreign intelligence services, communication intercepts discussing your recruitment. But now you're having doubts, Sarah observed. Your tattoo changed everything, Reynolds admitted. That tattoo is not something a foreign agent would have. It's not something someone pretending to be CIA would get. It's the kind of mark that only someone with genuine loyalty to the agency would carry, despite the operational security risks it presents. Combined with your knowledge of classified programs like memory modification and your detailed understanding of CIA operational procedures, it suggests that you are exactly who you claim to be. Walsh nodded in agreement. Which means we've been manipulated just as much as you have. Someone wanted you detained and interrogated by people who weren't official government personnel, people who could be disavowed if the operation went wrong. They needed deniability, and they needed to keep you away from anyone who might recognize inconsistencies in the case against you. Sarah's mind was racing as she tried to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy she was facing. Harrison and whoever he's working with needed to eliminate me as a witness to what I saw in Belgrade, but they also needed to do it in a way that wouldn't raise questions within the agency. So they created an elaborate frame job that would discredit me while simultaneously getting me killed in a way that couldn't be traced back to them. Except something went wrong, Reynolds added. Instead of simply killing you during the Prague operation, you were captured alive. Now they need to figure out how to clean up the mess without exposing themselves. The realization hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. They're going to try to have me killed here, aren't they? Make it look like I died during the interrogation, or that I tried to escape and was shot in the process. Clean, simple, and completely deniable. Walsh's expression was grim as he nodded. That was almost certainly the plan. But your tattoo has complicated things significantly. We know you're genuine CIA, which means killing you would be murdering a fellow American intelligence officer. That's a line that most of us aren't willing to cross, regardless of what we've been told about your supposed crimes. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since her capture. If Walsh and Reynolds were having doubts about the narrative they had been fed, it meant she might have allies in this facility after all. But she also knew that whoever was behind the conspiracy wouldn't give up easily. They had too much invested in her elimination to simply walk away now. So what happens next? She asked. Do you just let me walk out of here? It's not that simple, Reynolds replied. Even if we believe you're innocent, we're still contractors working for people who want you dead. If we simply release you, they'll know we've been compromised, and they'll find another way to eliminate both you and anyone who helped you. We need a plan that protects everyone involved while exposing the real conspirators. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind already working through the tactical possibilities. Despite the dire circumstances, she felt more like herself than she had since this ordeal began. She was no longer just a victim, she was an intelligence operative with 15 years of experience in situations exactly like this one. First, we need to document everything, she said. Every piece of evidence you were given, every communication you received, every instruction about how to handle my detention. If we're going to expose this conspiracy, we need a paper trail that leads back to the people who orchestrated it. Walsh was already nodding, pulling out a digital recorder. We can do that. But we also need to think about immediate security. The people who hired us are expecting regular updates on your interrogation. If we don't provide them, they're going to become suspicious. Then we give them what they want to hear, Sarah replied. You tell them that I'm breaking down under interrogation, that I'm starting to admit to crimes I didn't commit. Buy us time to gather evidence and plan our next move. Reynolds moved to the one-way mirror, peering through it as if she could see threats approaching from the other side. There's something else you should know. We intercepted communications suggesting that a cleanup crew is scheduled to arrive here within the next 24 hours. Our contract was supposed to end with your death, and they're bringing in specialists to handle the final phase of the operation. The cleanup crew Sarah knew what that meant. Professional killers who would eliminate not just her, but probably Walsh, Reynolds, and anyone else who had been involved in her detention. It was standard procedure for black operations that had grown too complex or compromised. Everyone involved would be silenced permanently, ensuring that the conspiracy could never be exposed. The mention of a cleanup crew shifted the entire dynamic in the room. Sarah could see the fear in Reynolds' eyes, the way Walsh's hands tightened into fists as he processed the implications of what they were facing. These weren't just contractors who had been misled about her identity, they were potential victims of the same conspiracy that had targeted her. How many people are in this facility? Sarah asked, her mind already shifting into operational planning mode. 12 total, Walsh replied. 8 guards, 2 technicians, Reynolds and myself. Most of them are good people, former military, trying to make a living in private security. They don't deserve to die because someone fed us false intelligence. Sarah stood up from her chair, pacing to the one-way mirror where Reynolds was still, keeping watch. Then we need to get them out of here before the cleanup crew arrives. But first, we need to gather every piece of evidence we can about who hired you and how this operation was set up. The contracts came through a shell company called Meridian Security Solutions, Reynolds said, turning away from the mirror. But the actual communications and operational orders came from someone identifying himself as Deputy Director Marcus Webb. He had all the right codes, all the proper authorization sequences, everything checked out through official channels. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Marcus Webb was real. He was Deputy Director of Operations, Harrison's immediate superior in the CIA hierarchy. If Webb was involved in the conspiracy, it meant the corruption went even higher than she had imagined. But it also raised the possibility that Webb was being impersonated or manipulated, just as Harrison's memories had been modified. Did you ever meet Webb in person? She asked. No, all communications were electronic or through secure phone lines, Walsh replied. Standard procedure for black operations. We never questioned it because everything seemed legitimate. That's because whoever is running this operation has access to the highest levels of CIA communication protocols, Sarah said, her mind racing through the implications. They can impersonate senior officials, forge authorization codes, and manipulate official records. This isn't just about eliminating me as a witness. This is about a fundamental compromise of American intelligence capabilities. The scope of what they were dealing with was becoming clearer by the minute. Someone had spent years, possibly decades, building a network of compromised officials within the CIA. They had the ability to manipulate memories, forge documents, impersonate senior officials, and conduct black operations without oversight. The question was whether this was a foreign intelligence operation designed to destroy American capabilities from within, or something even more sinister. We need to contact the FBI, Reynolds said. If the CIA has been compromised at this level, we need an outside agency to investigate. The FBI could be compromised too, Sarah replied. Interagency cooperation at the highest levels means that whoever is behind this might have access to FBI communications and personnel as well. We need to think bigger. We need to find someone outside the intelligence community who has the authority and resources to investigate this properly. Walsh was already shaking his head. Even if we could contact someone like that, who would believe us? We're talking about a conspiracy involving mind control, forged documents, and rogue CIA officials. It sounds like something out of a spy novel. Then we make sure we have evidence that's impossible to ignore, Sarah said firmly. We document everything. We record our conversations with the people who hired you, and we make sure that multiple copies of everything are distributed to different locations. If they kill us, the evidence will still surface. The plan was risky, but it was their only chance of survival and exposure of the conspiracy. Sarah knew that the cleanup crew would likely arrive within hours, not days. They needed to move quickly and efficiently, gathering evidence while simultaneously preparing to defend themselves against professional killers who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate everyone in the facility. "First things first," she said, moving toward the door. "I need to see the communications you received from Webb or whoever was impersonating him. Every email, every phone recording, every document. We need to analyze them for inconsistencies. That might reveal the true identity of the people behind this." As they left the interrogation room, Sarah felt a strange sense of déjà vu. She had been in similar situations before, trapped in hostile territory with limited resources and powerful enemies closing in. But this time felt different because the enemies weren't foreign agents or terrorist organizations. They were people who had sworn the same oath she had, people who were supposed to be on the same side. The communications center of the facility was a high-tech operations room filled with computer terminals, secure phone lines, and surveillance equipment. Reynolds led them to a bank of servers where all the electronic communications for the operation had been stored. "Everything's here," she said, pulling up files on one of the terminals. Communications logs, authorization codes, operational orders, even financial records showing payments to Meridian Security Solutions. Sarah studied the files carefully, looking for any inconsistencies or anomalies that might reveal the true source of the communications. What she found was even more disturbing than she had expected. The communications were perfect too perfect. Every authorization code was correct. Every procedural detail was accurate. Every bureaucratic nuance was exactly as it should be. "This level of operational knowledge doesn't come from infiltration or hacking," she said slowly. "This comes from someone who has spent decades inside the system. Someone who knows every protocol, every procedure, every operational detail. We're not dealing with foreign agents or outside actors. We're dealing with someone who is, or was, at the very top of American intelligence operations." The implications were staggering. If someone with that level of access and authority had been compromised or had gone rogue, it meant that virtually every CIA operation for the past several years could have been compromised. Assets could have been exposed, operations could have been sabotaged, and American national security could have been systematically undermined from within. "There's something else," Walsh said, pointing to a series of financial records on another terminal. The payments to Meridian Security Solutions didn't come from official CIA accounts. They came from a private account registered to something called the Phoenix Foundation. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Phoenix, the same code name that had been referenced in the Russian intelligence intercepts. The same code name that had been her operational designation 15 years ago. Someone was using her own identity as part of the conspiracy against her, creating a narrative in which she was both the victim and the perpetrator of the crimes being committed. The discovery of the Phoenix Foundation sent chills down Sarah's spine as she realized just how deep and personal this conspiracy had become. Someone hadn't just used her old code name in communications with Russian intelligence. They had created an entire financial infrastructure around her identity, making it appear as though she was funding the very operations designed to destroy her. "Pull up everything you can find on the Phoenix Foundation," she instructed Reynolds, who was already typing rapidly at the terminal. "Financial records, registration documents, anything that might tell us who's behind it." The information that appeared on the screen was like looking into a funhouse mirror version of her own life. The Phoenix Foundation had been established 3 years ago, coincidentally, right around the time of the Belgrade operation and her subsequent memory modification. The Foundation's stated purpose was supporting international security operations and intelligence gathering activities, which was vague enough to cover almost any kind of covert operation. But what was most disturbing were the financial records. The foundation had received millions of dollars in funding from sources that appeared to be legitimate government contracts, defense contractors, and even some private donors. However, when Sarah looked more closely at the transaction patterns, she began to see a different picture emerging. "These aren't random payments," she said, pointing to the screen. "Look at the timing and amounts. They correspond exactly with major CIA operations over the past 3 years. Someone has been systematically skimming money from legitimate intelligence operations and funneling it through this foundation." Walsh leaned over her shoulder to study the records. "That's embezzlement on a massive scale. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars that should have gone to support American intelligence operations. But where's the money going?" Reynolds asked, pulling up expenditure records for the foundation. "If someone is stealing this much money, they must be spending it on something." The expenditure records told a story that was even more sinister than simple embezzlement. The Phoenix Foundation had been funding a wide range of activities that appeared to be designed to undermine American intelligence capabilities. Payments to foreign hackers for cyber attacks on CIA systems. Funding for mercenary operations that had resulted in the deaths of American assets. Even payments to journalists and media outlets that had published stories exposing classified operations. "This isn't just about framing me or eliminating witnesses," Sarah realized with growing horror. "This is about systematically destroying American intelligence capabilities from within. Someone has been using stolen government funds to finance attacks on their own country." The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Whoever was behind the Phoenix Foundation had been operating for years, slowly and methodically weakening American intelligence operations while enriching themselves with stolen government funds. The frame job against Sarah wasn't the main operation. It was just one small part of a much larger conspiracy to undermine national security. "We need to copy all of this information and get it to someone who can act on it," Walsh said, pulling out a portable hard drive. "This is evidence of treason on a scale that could compromise national security for decades." But even as they worked to copy the files, Sarah's mind was racing ahead to the immediate tactical situation they faced. The cleanup crew was still coming, and all the evidence in the world wouldn't matter if they were dead before they could deliver it to the proper authorities. "How much time do we have before the cleanup crew arrives?" she asked. Reynolds checked her watch. "According to the last communication we received, they're scheduled to arrive in 6 hours. But if they're flying in from overseas, weather or flight delays could give us a few more hours. Or they could arrive early if they suspect something has gone wrong," Sarah pointed out. "We need to assume worst-case scenario and prepare for them to arrive within the next 2 to 3 hours. The tactical situation was challenging, but not impossible. The facility was designed to keep people in, not to defend against an outside attack. However, it did have some defensive advantages: reinforced walls, limited access points, and a security system that could be turned against attackers if properly utilized. First, we need to contact the local authorities and get them involved," Sarah said, outlining her plan. "Even if the FBI or other federal agencies are compromised, local law enforcement should be clean. We need them here as witnesses and backup. Then we need to prepare the facility for defense," Walsh added, understanding the direction of her thinking. "We have weapons, defensive positions, and the advantage of knowing the terrain. If we can hold off the cleanup crew until backup arrives, we might actually survive this." But Sarah knew that professional cleanup crews didn't rely solely on direct assault. They would use psychological warfare, deception, and possibly even chemical agents to eliminate their targets. The facility's enclosed environment could work against them if the attackers decided to use gas or other airborne weapons. "We also need an escape plan," she said. "Multiple escape routes, vehicles standing by, and contingency plans if the facility becomes untenable. We can't just hunker down and hope for the best." As they worked to implement these preparations, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. The conspiracy was too sophisticated, too well-funded, and too deeply embedded in American intelligence operations to be the work of a single rogue official or even a small group of conspirators. What if this goes all the way to the top? She asked suddenly, voicing the fear that had been growing in the back of her mind. What if the director of Central Intelligence himself is involved? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If the CIA had been compromised at the very highest levels, it would mean that virtually every aspect of American intelligence operations could be suspect. Assets around the world could be at risk, ongoing operations could be compromised, and the very foundations of national security could be crumbling from within. Then we're not just fighting for our lives, Reynolds said quietly. We're fighting for the survival of American intelligence capabilities. The weight of that responsibility settled on all of them as they continued their preparations. They weren't just trying to survive an assassination attempt. They were potentially the only people who could expose a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of American national security. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of frantic preparation as Sarah, Walsh, and Reynolds worked to turn the detention facility into a defensible position while simultaneously gathering evidence and contacting outside authorities, the facilities. Other personnel had been briefed on the situation, and while some were skeptical, the evidence they had uncovered was compelling enough to convince most of them that they were all in danger. Sarah had taken charge of the tactical preparations, drawing on her 15 years of experience in hostile environments to optimize their defensive capabilities. The facility had been designed with security in mind, but that security had been focused on keeping people in rather than keeping attackers out. However, with some creative modifications, they had managed to create multiple defensive positions, establish overlapping fields of fire, and set up early warning systems that would give them advance notice of any approaching vehicles. The local sheriff's department is sending a team, Reynolds reported from the communications center. But they're treating this as a possible hoax or mental health crisis. They don't really believe that we're about to be attacked by professional killers. Sarah wasn't surprised. The story they were telling: CIA conspiracies, memory modification. Rogue intelligence officials sounded like the ravings of paranoid conspiracy theorists. Local law enforcement didn't have the context or experience to understand the reality of what they were facing. What about federal authorities? Walsh asked. FBI, Homeland Security, anyone with the resources to handle this kind of situation? I've been trying, Reynolds replied, but every federal contact I've reached has either referred me to someone else or asked me to submit a formal report through official channels. No one wants to take responsibility for investigating allegations this serious without proper authorization. The bureaucratic runaround was frustrating but predictable. Federal agencies were designed to protect themselves from false accusations and political manipulation, which meant they were inherently suspicious of unsolicited reports of high-level corruption. The very safeguards that were supposed to protect American intelligence operations were now preventing them from exposing the conspiracy that threatened to destroy those operations. Then we're on our own until we can present evidence that's too compelling to ignore, Sarah said, checking her watch. The cleanup crew could arrive at any moment, and they needed to be ready. She had positioned herself at the facility's main entrance, where she could observe the access road while maintaining communication with the rest of the team. The building's security cameras had been modified to provide early warning coverage of all possible approach routes, and Walsh had distributed weapons and ammunition to everyone who was capable of using them effectively. The waiting was the hardest part. Sarah had been in combat situations before, but there was something uniquely nerve-wracking about knowing that professional killers were coming for you with unlimited resources and no legal constraints. The cleanup crew wouldn't be bound by rules of engagement or concerns about collateral damage. Their only objective was to eliminate everyone in the facility and destroy all evidence of the conspiracy. Movement on the access road Reynolds announced over the facility's intercom system. 3 black SUVs, approaching at high speed. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she peered through the reinforced windows at the approaching vehicles. 3 SUVs suggested a team of 9 to 12 operatives, probably armed with military-grade weapons and equipment. The vehicles were moving in a tactical formation, maintaining proper spacing and approaching from multiple angles simultaneously. "Everyone to defensive positions," Sarah commanded over the intercom. "Remember, these people are professionals, but so are we. Stay calm. Follow the plan, and we'll get through this." The SUVs stopped about 200 yards from the facility, well outside the range of small arms fire, but close enough for the occupants to observe the building and plan their assault. Sarah could see figures moving around the vehicles, but they were too far away to make out specific details about their equipment or numbers. "They're not attacking immediately," Walsh observed from his position overlooking the rear of the facility. "They're conducting reconnaissance, probably trying to determine our defensive capabilities and numbers." Sarah nodded, though Walsh couldn't see her from his position. Professional cleanup crews always conducted thorough reconnaissance before engaging their targets. They would want to know exactly what they were facing before committing to an assault that could result in casualties among their own team. "That works in our favor," she said over the intercom. "The longer they wait, the more time we have for backup to arrive. Local law enforcement should be here within the next 30 minutes. But even as she spoke, Sarah knew that local law enforcement wouldn't be much help against a professional cleanup crew. Small-town sheriff's deputies weren't equipped or trained to handle military-style assaults by former special operations personnel. At best, they might serve as witnesses to what happened. At worst, they could become additional casualties. Standoff continued for another 15 minutes, with both sides observing each other and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Sarah used the time to review their defensive positions and make final adjustments to their plans. The facility wasn't ideal for defense, but they had done the best they could with the resources available. Then, without warning, everything changed. "Sarah Martinez," a voice called out over a bullhorn from one of the SUVs. "This is Deputy Director Marcus Webb, Central Intelligence Agency. You are surrounded and outgunned. Surrender yourself immediately, and the others in the facility will not be harmed." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. The voice was familiar. She had heard Deputy Director Webb speak at briefings and ceremonies over the years. But was this really Webb, or was it someone impersonating him? And if it was really Webb, what did that mean for the scope of the conspiracy they were facing? "Sarah," the voice continued, "I know you can hear me. You're a decorated CIA officer who has served her country with distinction. Don't throw away your life and the lives of innocent people because of misunderstandings and miscommunications." The psychological warfare had begun. Webb, whoever was speaking, was trying to isolate Sarah from her allies by making it appear that she was the target and that everyone else would be safe if she surrendered. It was a classic manipulation tactic, designed to exploit her sense of responsibility and loyalty to protect others. But Sarah had no intention of surrendering, because she knew that professional cleanup crews didn't leave witnesses alive. Sarah keyed her radio to respond to the voice claiming to be Deputy Director Webb, knowing that every word she spoke would be critical to the psychological battle that was now underway. The cleanup crew was trying to isolate her from her allies by making them believe that surrendering her would guarantee their safety, a lie that could get everyone killed. "If you're really Deputy Director Webb," Sarah called back through the facility's external speaker system, "then you'll know the authentication code for Operation Nightingale. You'll also know why I was really in Prague and what happened to Viktor Petrov." There was a long pause before the voice responded, and Sarah could practically hear the consultation taking place among the attackers. Operation Nightingale had been a highly classified mission that she and Webb had worked on together 2 years earlier. If this was really Webb, he would know the authentication codes. If it wasn't, they would either have to admit their deception or try to bluff their way through. "Sarah, this isn't the time for games," the voice finally replied. But she noticed that he had avoided providing the authentication code. "You're in possession of classified materials that compromise ongoing operations. People are going to die if this information falls into the wrong hands." "The only people who are going to die," Sarah responded, "are the ones you brought with you to clean up your conspiracy. I know about the Phoenix Foundation, Marcus. I know about the embezzled funds, the compromised operations, and the systematic undermining of American intelligence capabilities. The question is whether you're part of it willingly, or whether you're just another victim of whoever is really running this operation." The psychological dynamic had shifted. Instead of Sarah being isolated and defensive, she was now forcing the attackers to respond to her accusations. If Webb was really involved in the conspiracy, her knowledge of the Phoenix Foundation would rattle him. If he was being manipulated or impersonated, it might help him understand what was really happening. "You're talking about things you don't understand," the voice replied. But there was a different tone now, less confident, more defensive. "Stand down, Agent Martinez. That's a direct order. I don't take orders from people who finance attacks on their own country," Sarah shot back. "And I especially don't take orders from people who are too cowardly to provide proper authentication when challenged." She could see movement around the SUVs as the attackers repositioned themselves for what appeared to be an imminent assault. The psychological warfare phase was ending, and the shooting was about to start. Sarah checked her weapon one final time and reviewed the defensive positions of her team. "Movement on all sides," Walsh reported over the intercom. "They're surrounding the facility. Looks like at least 12 operatives, military-grade equipment, body armor." Sarah had expected this. Professional cleanup crews typically outnumbered their targets by at least 3-1, and they always came prepared for significant resistance. The question was whether her team could hold out long enough for help to arrive, and whether the local authorities would be able to handle the situation when they did arrive. "Remember the plan," she announced over the intercom. "We're not trying to win a pitched battle against superior forces. We're trying to survive long enough to get our evidence to the proper authorities. Every minute we hold out is a victory." The first shots came from the attackers, high-powered rifle rounds that shattered the facility's reinforced windows and sent concrete fragments flying through the air. Sarah ducked behind her defensive position and returned fire, aiming for the muzzle flashes she could see from the attackers' positions. The assault was coordinated and professional, with attackers approaching from multiple directions while providing covering fire for each other. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of military-grade weapons and the heavier boom of what sounded like explosive charges being used to breach the facility's walls. "They're trying to breach the rear wall," Walsh reported, his voice tight with stress. "I can hold them off for a few minutes, but they've got explosive charges." Sarah made a quick tactical decision. "Fall back to the secondary positions. Don't try to hold ground that can't be held. We need to funnel them into kill zones where we have the advantage." The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire, explosions, and tactical movement as both sides maneuvered for advantage. Sarah's team was outnumbered and outgunned, but they knew the facility's layout and had prepared defensive positions that maximized their limited advantages. Then, just as the situation was becoming desperate, Sarah heard the most beautiful sound. In the world, sirens approaching from multiple directions. "Local law enforcement is arriving," Reynolds announced over the intercom, relief evident in her voice. "Multiple units, and it sounds like they brought backup." The attackers had heard the sirens too, and Sarah could see them beginning to disengage from their assault positions. Professional cleanup crews didn't stick around to explain themselves to local law enforcement, especially when their operations had gone sideways and attracted unwanted attention. "They're withdrawing," Walsh reported, "moving back to their vehicles." Sarah watched as the 3 SUVs pulled away from the facility at high speed, leaving behind evidence of their assault, but taking their personnel with them. The immediate threat was over, but she knew that this was far from the end of the conspiracy they had uncovered. As local law enforcement officers cautiously approached the facility, Sarah realized that the real work was just beginning. They had survived the cleanup crew's attack, but now they had to convince skeptical authorities to investigate a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of American intelligence operations. The evidence they had gathered would be crucial. But Sarah knew that powerful people with unlimited resources wouldn't give up easily. The Phoenix Foundation conspiracy was too valuable, too well established, and too deeply embedded in the intelligence community to be exposed without a fight. But as she walked out of the facility with her hands raised to show the approaching officers that she wasn't a threat, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. They had survived, they had evidence, and they had allies who were willing to risk their lives to expose the truth. The war was far from over, but they had won this battle. The aftermath of the assault on the detention facility was a whirlwind of interviews, evidence collection, and bureaucratic maneuvering that stretched on for hours. Local law enforcement had cordoned off the area and called in federal authorities, but Sarah could see the same institutional reluctance to believe their story that had plagued their earlier attempts to report the conspiracy. FBI agent Patricia Chun, who had been assigned as the lead investigator, sat across from Sarah in the back of an FBI mobile command unit that had been set up outside the facility. Chun was professional and thorough, but Sarah could detect the skepticism in her voice as she reviewed the evidence they had gathered. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Agent Chun said, consulting her notes. "You're alleging that senior CIA officials have been running a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme, using mind control techniques on their own personnel, and hiring mercenaries to eliminate witnesses to their crimes." Sarah nodded. "I know how it sounds, Agent Chun, but we have financial records, communications logs, and physical evidence of the attack that just took place. This isn't a delusion or a conspiracy theory. This is a systematic compromise of American intelligence operations." Agent Chun pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a series of official documents. According to CIA records, Agent Sarah Martinez died in a car accident in Prague 3 days ago. Her body was cremated and her ashes were returned to her family. So either you're lying about your identity, or someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to fake your death. "They faked my death to eliminate me as a witness," Sarah explained for what felt like the 100th time. "I saw things in Belgrade that compromised their operation, so they used memory modification techniques to make me forget, then orchestrated an elaborate frame job to discredit me before having me killed." The FBI agent made notes on her tablet, but Sarah could see that she remained skeptical. The story was simply too outlandish for someone without intelligence background to fully accept. Despite the evidence they had presented, "What we need," Agent Chun said, "is corroboration from official sources. Someone within the CIA who can verify your identity and confirm that these allegations have merit." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. "The problem is that we don't know how far the conspiracy reaches. Anyone we contact within the agency could be compromised, or could alert the conspirators that we've survived and are talking to federal authorities." But even as she spoke, Sarah realized that they had no choice. The evidence they had gathered was compelling, but it would never be enough to bring down a conspiracy this sophisticated without insider cooperation. They needed someone within the CIA who could verify the authenticity of the documents they had uncovered and provide additional evidence of the crimes being committed. "There is someone," Sarah said reluctantly. "Assistant Director Janet Morrison, Counterintelligence Division. She's been investigating irregularities in CIA financial operations for the past year. If anyone would be positioned to understand what we've discovered, it would be her." Agent Chun made a note of the name. We'll reach out to Assistant Director Morrison through official channels. But in the meantime, you and your associates are going to be held in protective custody. If even half of what you're alleging is true, your lives are in serious danger." The next 12 hours were a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and secure communications as federal authorities began the complex process of investigating the conspiracy Sarah had exposed. She was held in a federal safe house outside the city, with round-the-clock protection and limited communication with the outside world. But despite the security measures, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger. Professional cleanup crews didn't give up after a single failed operation. They regrouped, adapted their tactics, and tried again. The people behind the Phoenix Foundation conspiracy had too much to lose to simply accept exposure and prosecution. Her concerns proved justified when Agent Chun arrived at the safe house with disturbing news. "We've made contact with Assistant Director Morrison," Chun reported. "But there's a problem. According to her records, she's never heard of Agent Sarah Martinez, and she has no knowledge of any investigation into CIA financial irregularities." Sarah felt her heart sink. Morrison's memories had been modified as well, or worse, Morrison herself might be part of the conspiracy. The reach of the operation was even broader than she had feared. However, Agent Chun continued, Morrison did say something interesting. She mentioned that there have been a series of unexplained deaths and disappearances among CIA personnel over the past 3 years. Operations officers who were investigating financial irregularities, counterintelligence agents who were looking into possible security breaches, even administrative personnel who had access to sensitive financial records. The pattern was becoming clear. The Phoenix Foundation conspiracy hadn't just been embezzling money and compromising operations. They had been systematically eliminating anyone who might stumble across evidence of their crimes. Sarah's case wasn't unique. It was just the latest in a long series of similar operations designed to protect the conspiracy from exposure. "We need to expand the investigation," Sarah said. "Those deaths and disappearances aren't coincidental. They're evidence of a cleaning operation that's been going on for years. If we can establish patterns in the timing and methods, we might be able to identify the people responsible." Agent Chun nodded. "We're already working on that. The Bureau is pulling files on every CIA personnel death or disappearance over the past 5 years. But we're also dealing with institutional resistance from the agency itself. They're claiming that our investigation threatens ongoing operations and national security." Sarah wasn't surprised. The conspiracy had been operating within the CIA for years, which meant they had allies and resources throughout the organization. They would use every bureaucratic and legal tool at their disposal to prevent exposure, even if it meant compromising legitimate investigations and operations. "There's something else," Agent Chun said, her expression growing more serious. "We intercepted communications suggesting that another cleanup operation is being planned. The people behind this conspiracy haven't given up. They're planning to eliminate everyone involved in exposing them, including federal investigators." The news confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The conspiracy was too deeply embedded and too well-resourced to be exposed through normal investigative channels. They were dealing with people who had unlimited access to classified information, sophisticated surveillance capabilities, and no scruples about killing federal agents to protect their operation. "Then we need to move faster," Sarah said. "Every day we delay gives them more time to cover their tracks, eliminate evidence, and plan their next attack. We need to take this public, get the evidence out to multiple sources simultaneously, and force the conspiracy into the open where they can't operate in the shadows." Agent Chun's expression grew troubled as she processed Sarah's suggestion about taking the investigation public. "That's a dangerous strategy, Agent Martinez. If we go public too early, we risk compromising ongoing investigations, alerting other members of the conspiracy, and potentially getting more people killed." Sarah understood the concerns, but she also knew that traditional investigative approaches weren't going to work against an adversary this sophisticated and well-connected. Agent Chun, these people have been operating for years without detection. They have access to the highest levels of government, unlimited financial resources, and the ability to eliminate anyone who threatens them. If we try to investigate them through normal channels, they'll always be one step ahead of us. The safe house's secure phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Agent Chun answered it, listened for a moment, then handed the phone to Sarah. With a grim expression, "It's for you," she said. "Someone claiming to be Deputy Director Marcus Webb." Sarah took the phone cautiously, knowing that this could be another impersonation attempt or psychological manipulation. But when the voice on the other end spoke, she immediately recognized the authentic speech patterns and mannerisms of the real Marcus Webb. "Agent Martinez," Webb's voice was tense with urgency. "Thank God you're alive. We've been trying to piece together what happened to you for the past 72 hours, and what we've discovered is terrifying. How do I know this is really you?" Sarah asked, still wary of deception. "Operation Nightingale, authentication code Bravo 7 Alpha 9, Webb replied immediately. "You were the lead operative on that mission, and you saved my life when the extraction went sideways in Bucharest." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Those were details that only the real Webb would know, and his immediate provision of the authentication code proved that he was genuine. But it also raised new questions about who had been impersonating him during the assault on the detention facility. "Marcus, someone has been using your identity to authorize black operations," she said. "They hired mercenaries to interrogate and kill me, and they've been embezzling millions of dollars through something called the Phoenix Foundation." "I know," Webb replied grimly. "We've been investigating irregularities in our operational funding for months, but we didn't realize the scope of what we were dealing with until you disappeared. Someone has been systematically compromising our operations, stealing our funds, and eliminating anyone who gets too close to the truth." Sarah felt a surge of hope. If Webb was investigating the conspiracy from within the CIA, it meant she finally had a high-level ally who could provide institutional support for exposing the crimes being committed. "Who's behind it?" she asked. There was a long pause before Webb answered. "That's the problem, Sarah. The evidence points to someone at the very top of the agency hierarchy. Someone with access to the most classified operations, the highest level financial accounts, and the authority to authorize memory modification procedures." The implications were staggering. If the conspiracy reached to the director of Central Intelligence himself, it would mean that the entire American intelligence apparatus had been compromised from within. Every operation, every asset, every piece of classified information could be at risk. "We need to meet," Webb continued. "But it has to be somewhere secure, somewhere they can't monitor or intercept our communications. The safe house you're in now isn't secure, they know about it." Agent Chun, who had been listening to the conversation, immediately began making preparations to move Sarah to a new location. But Sarah was thinking tactically, trying to anticipate the next moves of both allies and enemies. "Marcus, if they know about this safe house, they're probably planning another cleanup operation," she said. "We need to be ready for them." "Already in progress," Webb replied. "I've got a team of trusted operatives en route to your location, but you need to be prepared to move fast when they arrive. The conspiracy has resources we're still discovering, and they won't hesitate to eliminate federal agents along with CIA personnel." The next hour was a tense period of preparation and waiting as Sarah, Agent Chun, and the FBI security team prepared for both evacuation and potential attack. The evidence they had gathered was copied to multiple secure servers and distributed to various federal agencies, ensuring that it would survive even if they didn't. When Webb's extraction team arrived, they came in a convoy of unmarked vehicles. with enough firepower to handle significant resistance. The team leader, a grizzled CIA operative named Colonel Harrison, briefed Sarah on the tactical situation as they prepared to move. "We've identified at least 3 separate cleanup crews converging on this area," he reported. "Professional operators, former special forces, heavily armed and equipped. They're not planning to take prisoners this time." Sarah nodded grimly. The conspiracy was escalating its response, moving from subtle manipulation to open warfare. But that also meant they were becoming desperate, which created opportunities for their opponents. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Secure facility outside Washington," Colonel Harrison replied. "Deputy Director, Webb is assembling a task force of trusted personnel to investigate this conspiracy and bring the perpetrators to justice. But we need to get you there alive first." As they prepared to leave the safe house, Sarah caught sight of movement in the tree line surrounding the property. Dark figures moving with military precision, positioning themselves for what appeared to be a coordinated assault on the building. "Contact!" she shouted, diving for cover as the first shots rang out. The battle for the safe house was brief but intense, with Webb's extraction team using superior tactics and positioning to overcome the cleanup crew's numerical advantage. But Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger conflict that would determine the future of American intelligence operations. As they fought their way to the extraction vehicles, Sarah realized that the small tattoo on her back had become the catalyst for exposing one of the most significant intelligence scandals in American history. The eagle and shield that marked her as CIA had saved not just her own life, but potentially the integrity of the entire agency. The secure facility outside Washington was unlike any CIA installation Sarah had ever seen. Built into a hillside and accessible only through multiple layers of security checkpoints, it appeared to be designed specifically for investigating threats from within the intelligence community itself. Deputy Director Webb met them at the entrance, his face grim with the weight of what they had discovered about the conspiracy. "Welcome to Operation Clean House," Webb said as he escorted Sarah through the facility's corridors. "This is where we're going to dismantle the Phoenix Foundation conspiracy and restore integrity to American intelligence operations." The main operations center was a hive of activity, with dozens of investigators, analysts, and technical specialists working to piece together the full scope of the criminal enterprise they were facing. Wall-mounted screens displayed financial flowcharts, personnel records, and operational timelines that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning multiple years and involving hundreds of millions of dollars. "We've been able to verify most of the evidence you gathered," Webb continued, leading Sarah to a briefing room where senior officials from multiple agencies were assembled. The Phoenix Foundation was indeed embezzling funds from legitimate CIA operations, but that was just one part of a much larger criminal enterprise. Assistant Director Morrison from Counterintelligence was there, along with FBI Director Reynolds and officials from the Department of Justice. Sarah was surprised to see that Morrison appeared to remember their previous interactions, suggesting that her memory modification had been reversed or was less comprehensive than initially believed. "Agent Martinez," Director Reynolds said as Sarah took her seat at the conference table, "your survival and the evidence you helped gather have exposed one of the most significant intelligence scandals in American history. We're looking at charges of treason, embezzlement, murder, and conspiracy that could result in dozens of life sentences." The briefing that followed revealed the staggering scope of the Phoenix Foundation conspiracy. Over the past 5 years, the criminal organization had embezzled more than $200 million from CIA operational funds, used those resources to finance attacks on American intelligence assets, and systematically eliminated more than 30 CIA personnel who had stumbled across evidence of their crimes. "The leader of the conspiracy," Webb announced, pulling up a photograph on the main screen, "is someone we never suspected. Assistant Director Thomas Harrison, European Operations Division. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as she saw the face of the man who had been her handler for 8 years. Harrison, who had recruited her, supervised her most dangerous missions, and earned her complete trust and loyalty. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound she had ever suffered. Harrison had access to everything, Morrison explained. Operational plans, financial records, personnel files, even the most classified research into memory modification techniques, he used that. Access to build a criminal empire that nearly destroyed American intelligence capabilities in Europe and beyond. The evidence against Harrison was overwhelming. Financial records showed that he had been the primary beneficiary of the Phoenix Foundation's embezzled funds, using the money to purchase properties around the world, maintain a lavish lifestyle, and finance additional criminal operations. Communication intercepts revealed that he had been selling classified information to foreign intelligence services for years, compromising operations and getting American assets killed. But Harrison didn't work alone, Webb continued. We've identified at least 12 other CIA officials who were part of the conspiracy, along with dozens of contractors, mercenaries, and foreign agents who helped facilitate their crimes. The scope of the cleanup operation that followed was unprecedented in CIA history. Entire divisions were investigated, operational procedures were overhauled, and new security measures were implemented to prevent similar conspiracies from taking root. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, providing testimony, identifying suspects, and helping to rebuild the European Operations Division from the ground up. The legal proceedings took more than 2 years to complete, but the results were decisive. Harrison was convicted on multiple counts of treason, embezzlement, and murder, receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His co-conspirators received similar sentences, and the Phoenix Foundation's stolen assets were recovered and returned to legitimate government accounts. For Sarah, the aftermath of the conspiracy's exposure brought both vindication and challenges. Her official death was reversed, her service record was restored, and she received commendations for her role in exposing the criminal enterprise. But the memory modification procedure she had undergone left lasting effects, and she struggled with gaps in her recollection of certain operations and relationships. "The tattoo saved your life," Webb told her during one of their debriefing sessions. "When those contractors saw the CIA on your back, it forced them to question the narrative they had been fed about your supposed crimes. Without that moment of doubt, you never would have survived long enough to expose the conspiracy." Sarah touched the spot between her shoulder blades where the small tattoo remained, a permanent reminder of her service and sacrifice. What had once seemed like a youthful mistake had become the key to one of the most important counterintelligence operations in CIA history. Years later, as she looked back on the events that had nearly cost her life, Sarah realized that the conspiracy's greatest mistake had been underestimating the power of loyalty and truth. They had built their criminal empire on lies, deception, and betrayal, but ultimately, those foundations had proven insufficient to withstand the light of exposure. The Phoenix Foundation was gone, its leaders imprisoned, and its victims remembered. American intelligence operations had been strengthened by the reforms implemented in the wake of the scandal. And Sarah Martinez, the CIA operative who had been marked for death, had lived to see justice served and her country's security restored. The eagle tattooed on her back remained a symbol of her unwavering commitment to the values and principles that had guided her through the darkest chapters of her career. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest marks can have the greatest impact on history. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.